Hello, everyone. We have a special guest with us today, the Mazda Miata, in which we are traveling to Tone Town. Every episode, getting a little bit closer, is a little bit extra cozy. And I might say we're going to be a little bit more enlightened today. I feel a little more distinguished already because we have another accent joining us from the UK. And we have none other than Martin Kidd. I don't know if I'm overstating this. I don't think I am, but a world-renowned amp designer, tech, working currently with Victory Amps in the UK. And before I pass over to you, Martin, to say hello, I just want to say the whole reason that I wanted to get you guys on this episode, and specifically you on the episode, is because I came across the Duchess, and specifically the pedalboard friendly version, where it is a blend of real tube solid state tech with two notes doing amp and cab sim, among many other options it can pull off. Like, man, we got to talk about this among other things that Victory is doing. And so Martin, welcome. I don't know if you want to say hello and we can get into this and get started.
Hello everybody, and thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for the build up.
Yeah. There's going to be much more where that came from throughout the episode. But where in the UK are you joining us from today?
I'm currently in London, Wimbledon, so where the tennis comes from.
I've heard of it.
So that's where I am.
So do you have a one-handed backhand or a two-handed backhand, Martin? That's the real question.
I have no backhand.
I'm with you. Mason is very much into tennis, so yeah.
Yes, no, I was never very good at that sort of thing. Table tennis, I was okay.
There we go. I'm really good at tennis in my head. I can envision these great shots, and then I pull them off in real life, and it always goes over the fence, way up into the distance. So luckily, we aren't talking about tennis today, though. We're talking about guitar.
It wouldn't be very long, would it, if we were talking about tennis?
So, Martin, as I mentioned in the intro, you obviously are very familiar with amps, building them, designing them. I can assume probably repairing as well over the years.
Yes.
Can I ask, I know you got started, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these details, but in and around the 90s, can you give us some insight into, why amps, why guitars, and, how did you get started? Is there any kind of backstory there?
There is. I played guitar, and I would read, I'd like to read about what gear guitar players were using. And oddly, it was around about the late 80s, and people were using racks, and they would be driven by a Marshall head or something like that into a dummy load and then processed. And I was fascinated by this. I didn't understand why sometimes somebody's rack would have 3 even-tied TC 290, I believe, or why you'd need all of that. But I was fascinated. I was fascinated by the processing and the sounds, and I went down that rabbit hole, I suppose. And I never thought it sounded that great. It didn't have so many of the elements that a guitar amplifier on its own has. And I think what really changed my mind and made me go away from the rack setup was I went to see a local band at one of our local pubs, and I thought, what a great sound this chap's got. And he had a Fender Telecaster, a Fender Twin Reverb, and I think a Boss Overdrive, Boss Delay, Boss Chorus. That was it. That was his setup. So I thought, right, amps is where it is. So I'll sell all my rack stuff and I'll go back to using an amp. But the sounds I was hearing on records, so the people I was listening to would be the likes of Eddie Van Halen, Steve Vai, Vane Malmsteen, Gary Moore. And those were sounds I couldn't seem to get from my Marshall unless I got somewhere near it if I was able to crank it up. So I thought, well, they can do that, but I get into trouble if I play that loud. I get into trouble. I get told off, and I get moaned at by other members of the band or sound engineers or whatever. So I noticed I got hold of a copy of the Tube Amp book by Aspen Pittman, bless him, and in there was a master volume modification, and I'd got a very sad. It was a 100-watt super lead Marshall that I'd got very cheaply from a local music shop because it didn't work really, and I didn't know very much about amps at the time. A friend of mine repaired it, got it running, and I decided that if this modification in the Tube Amp book was in there, it's probably something I could do. So I did it. I managed to get the right. I think I only needed to acquire the pot, the master volume pot, and I wired it up, and it worked. And the sort of person I am, that was enough to inspire me to think, well, perhaps I could do other things, and which is perhaps arrogant or just stupid or both. So that's what started me off, was the fact that this master volume modification worked, so that enabled me to finally use my Marshall. And if I got another one, I'd be able to do that. But then I thought, well, I wonder if I look at the circuits that in the Tube Amp book, what I can learn from those, and whether I could perhaps modify this Marshall circuit, which is just the super lead. Perhaps I could make it like a master volume amplifier, and perhaps I could, I could experiment. Again, it was madness, really, because my electronics knowledge at the time. So this is 1991. My electronics knowledge wasn't great. I'd sort of got what I suppose you might describe as high school. I left perhaps your average 16-year-old might have it. That had stayed with me. So I was 27 at the time. So I learned to, I went back and tried to remember what I'd learnt in physics at school. And it just went from there, really, just experimentation. So that's in brief the backstory. One interesting thing, and a thing that spurred me on, was when I did do the master volume modification from the Tube Amp book, that highlighted the fact that my particular Marshall had actually come out of the factory wrong.
No way.
Oh.
And yeah, it was the second gain stage. So it's the gain stage before the cathode follower that drives the tone stack. The stage before that, so it's kind of the second gain stage, the cathode resistor was 10k instead of 820 ohms or 1k.
Mm-hmm.
And
so 10 times ish what it should have been.
Yeah. So much reduced gain, but it was obscured by a 680 nanofarad capacitor. So that took me a while to discover that, because it looked okay in the shadows. It was only when I thought, well, I wonder if there's a problem with that capacitor. I was sort of taking things off and seeing what difference it made. And when I lifted that capacitor off, I thought, well, that's not a 1K resistor. But I wasn't, this is how early on it was. I wasn't 100% sure that the orange band I could see was that orange or red, and so I thought I better make sure that I don't go and take this out, put the same value in, and get the same result. But so I managed to acquire some. We used to have local shops that sold bits and bobs for hobbyists called Tandy, but they sold a load of Radio Shack components. So you could buy literally 2 resistors if you wanted to for a few pennies. And so I managed to get a couple of about the right value and put those in, and the amp worked and sounded excellent to my ears at the time. I think probably because I'd actually made it work properly.
So a 10-cent part was the issue in a very expensive amplifier. Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't an expensive amplifier. It was a very cheap one at the time. It's going back to those days. You could pick up super leads and the what they used to call the JCM 800 and JMP master volume circuit amplifiers. You could get those for £200. I don't know what that would equate to now. About, I don't know, $250 possibly.
Yeah, something around there.
Something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So you could get them quite cheaply.
And was it a 70s super lead, or was it a 60s, or what generation was the one that you?
It was a 69. So it was all tag board.
Yeah.
Or turret board with all hand wired.
Yeah.
And I should be ashamed of myself really for butchering that. But people weren't interested in those particularly at the time.
Yeah.
Well, the price, I guess, reflects that. Hey.
It does, yes. Yeah, but nowadays those are probably 10 times that sort of money.
Do you still have it?
No. Again, another reason I should be ashamed. But there you go. You live and learn.
Yeah. But, I have a 69 super lead sitting right next to me here. So.
Oh, right. Is that 100 watt?
Yeah. Super lead 100, and then I have a JMP 50. Vertical input, like a 78 in a fawn, head. But amazing amps, especially as you said, when you can get them loud, the character of what they do is fundamentally different. I think one of the interesting things, and I'm curious as an amp maker, where you sit on this, Martin, is I think that there seems to be a misconception from the public, especially now that modeling and simulations of amps have become more pervasive. The sound that people have come to hone in on as Plexi is probably quite aggressive comparatively to how, if you had an actual Plexi or a late 60s Super Lead 100 would actually behave. Like, they're pretty clean. I would say they would almost be Marshall's answer to a twin reverb until maybe you get it up to a certain volume, and a lot of that is also speaker distortion, not necessarily what the amplifier is producing, because the greenbacks are fairly inefficient. And so as a kid, before I actually owned these amps and I had a Line 6 pod or something like that, I always thought that a Plexi was pretty aggressive. But when I got one in person, I realized, like, this is so blisteringly clean and loud before it gets to the point where it turns over into kind of clipping, that it's not the fire breathing monster that you would expect it to be based on what the models would have you believe the sound is. Do you have any opinion on that?
My opinion is you're absolutely right. And when Victory first ventured down the path of making an M-type amplifier, so that was the early iterations, the Sheriff 22 and the Sheriff 44. I thought, we discussed and we said, let's make a Plexi sounding amplifier, but without having to have it so loud, because they are painful if you're not careful. If you're standing too near one and your volume is off and you just hit a string, and then just literally on the high treble channel you get it from off to, so a sound is coming through, and it can, you have to sort of whip your head out the way all of a sudden, don't you, because it's that loud. And so the early Sheriff iterations were they were along the cleaner lines. And it became apparent that what people thought the sound of a Plexi was the sounds they'd heard on records, and it's the sounds of a lot of them. It's the sounds of amplifiers modified by Jose Arredondo. So the sound that Eddie Van Halen had, which is that was a fascinating sound to me. Even before I played a guitar. So when I was about 16, I couldn't play a guitar. And I heard that, and even then, it sounded different to everyone else's. There was something about it, which turned out to be, apart from the amp, it was the tuning, the way he tuned his guitar. The B and G string, he would tune those so that the major third interval was less, almost discordant. So I think he used to refer to it as a beatless third or something like that. So he would tune those so that it's almost like the B harmonic on the G and the B harmonic on the B. He would tune those together, and then you get a more harmonious sound. But going back to the Plexi sound, you're absolutely right. A lot of people would be surprised if you handed them a guitar plugged into a 100-watt Plexi. They wouldn't. It's not a sound they would equate with what they've heard on records, and that's because I think a lot of what we've heard on records are either modified Plexis, very good examples of Plexis, or very loud ones boosted with something.
Yeah,
like some kind of treble boost or
fuzz.
Like Randy Rhoads, he had a modification, I believe, where the normal channel drove the high treble channel, and then he also drove that with a MXR distortion plus. Yeah, horrible. Well, they're not horrible, but they're one of those pebbles again. If you've got a Marshall and an MXR distortion plus and expect it to sound like Randy Rhoads, it's the same thing. You'd think, what's all this about? It doesn't sound anything like it. And again, the amp needs to be loud in order for that pedal to start to do its thing. Yeah. If you plug that into a clean amplifier, you get a very hi-fi representation of the pedal, which isn't perhaps what you want.
Yeah,
I would say.
Martin, I want to keep chatting about this and maybe get into some of the stuff you're doing and have done with Victory. Before we move on, though, I want to throw it to Mason here for a quick ad break to tell us about a couple of sponsors that make the podcast possible.
Okay. The first sponsor that makes this podcast possible are our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary in McKinney, Texas. It is the premier guitar store in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Whether you're looking for high-quality boutique amplifiers such as Victory, or you're looking for buffers like those from Goodwood or Vertex, or you're looking for any sorts of pedals, amplifiers, or guitars, they're the place you want to go. Check out guitarsanctuary.com to see everything that they have in their inventory, or go in person over in McKinney, Texas. I also want to talk about Neural DSP. Now, Neural DSP is offering our listeners a special discount code to get 30% off any of their plugins that you desire. And that's 30% off, meaning it is, what are we saying, 70% away from free?
Correct.
Just think about it like that. If you're having trouble sort of, quantifying the amount that it costs, 70% away from free. And this applies to any of the plugins that are 90 days or older. So if there's a new plugin out that is still full price, just wait that 90 days, and then that should be available for the discount as well. I also want to talk about the new Chorus OS that they have for their software update on the Quad Cortex that's allowing you to take these plugins and migrate them onto your Quad Cortex. So far, they've done that for the Gojira and for the Plini plugins, but this is slowly going to roll out for all of the plugins that are available from Neural. So definitely do check that out in the newest software update. I've already done it to my Quad Cortex, and it is pretty amazing. If you're not going to use a tube amp, which I still recommend people do, this is a great methadone to the real thing. So I would say definitely worth checking out. I definitely use them for my workflow, and highly recommend the products. Go over to neuraldsp.com. Use the coupon code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, to get that 30% off. Grant, back to you.
Thanks, Mason. So, Martin, I know we've mentioned this a couple times now, but you're currently, designing some pretty incredible products for Victory. And there was one recently. I saw Chris Buck. He posted on Instagram, and he was kind of choosing these different colors for the amp color. I don't want to say Tolex because I know it's actually finished in leather, which is really cool. So he was, picking out all these colors and face plates and all that. And so I was trying to learn what I could about these amps. And the big thing that stood out to me was these MK cleans. I believe that's the right terminology for them, this new amp. Yeah. The thing that stood out, and I want to ask you about, is that you've designed these amps, and part of the pitch behind them is this is an amp that you get, and there are no corners cut. There's no expense spared on making these amps. And I mean, that's backed up by the fact that they're covered in leather, a very hard, and Brian knows this because he used to cover amps and work for Jackson Ampworks in the States. But what is it about these amps? And I guess my specific question to get us started into them is, what do you love about the amp, but also what does it practically mean on a foundational level that there's no expense spared? Like what, in contrast with other amp companies usually cut corners on, that something like the MK Clean simply doesn't?
I think an important thing to me is consistency and ease of servicing, because try as you might, an amplifier may need to be repaired for whatever reasons. And so I think the no expense spared, it was more a case of we would look at what we wanted to use, say, in terms of potentiometers or capacitors in the audio path, etc. And we wouldn't say, well, we'll use say, a poly box because we know they work. We know they're perfectly reliable. We never have any problems with those kinds of things. But on these sort of more premium products, we know that little things may be discernible to the people that are buying them. And so we happen to know, for instance, that the yellow they're not mustard caps. They're not like the old Mullard mustard caps, but the yellow, they're like a film, a wound foil cap. And we know that they're very stable in terms of temperature, for instance. And so if you've got an amp that's running in the UK, then it's never going to get that lovely warm climate to live in. But some places we've our experience, our combined experience of Victory over the years, we've found that some capacitors, they actually vary quite a bit in terms of their value depending on their temperature. So we thought, right, we'll use these Vichet capacitors because we will be able to say that this amplifier will sound the same all over the world, as a for instance, and we'll use the resistors that we put in all of our amplifiers, which are 1% tolerance, so that we can guarantee that the amp, we can guarantee a more consistent sounding amplifier, rather than I think we'll all agree that if we've tried, say, 10 vintage amplifiers, vintage Fenders, Marshalls, Voxes, they won't all sound the same. And so you'll get a very good example if you're lucky, but you can also get some quite bad examples or quite disappointing.
They weren't using 1%, caps, and also in most cases not matched power tubes in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and that's quite an interesting thing, that the matching process. If you talk about matching output valves, as we know, the world situation in terms of what valves are available, there aren't many company or not many factories producing valves in production quantities. So that's one of the areas where we're quite limited in terms of what we can fit, because I would imagine the soft tech valves, they're quite robust, but actually what is actually happening in the factory there in St. Petersburg, who knows? They may not be producing things. I know they have problems occasionally in that area. So we're using largely JJ or the Chinese, either Shuguang or PS Vane at the moment. But matching, when you look at people's matching processes, they differ quite a bit. And a lot of the time, you can put a matched set of valves in to an amplifier, and they'll appear to be quite nicely matched because they're idle. But you can put them all into the same set of conditions. I don't know. So you might have minus 47 volts on the grid of a set of 6L6s, and they've got, say, 450 volts on the plates, and they'll all idle at 36 milliamps or within a fraction of a milliamp. Doesn't mean to say they're actually well matched. That because the transconductance and at what point perhaps those particular valves might draw a grid current, that may not be taken into consideration, and so you have to, I think, to some extent, trust that the people that are matching the valves match them not just on their idling current, so not just plugging them into, so they actually test them and they see the transconductance of particular valves and what other behaviors, and log each of those parameters and then pair them or put them in groups of in quads or sixes, sextets or what have you. So we have to trust that all of those parameters have been looked at.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's necessary to have somebody that has many years of experience in knowing how a valve will behave when it's put into a circuit, rather than it's possible to give someone a set of parameters and a set of things to look at and to test for, and they can put them in and into a modern test machine. But the trouble is with some of the modern test machines is they'll fail valves that are perfectly good. It's just that the test parameters perhaps are those of a perfect Mullard ECC83 or EL34 from the 60s, and so a lot of valves unfortunately won't match up to those parameters these days. So matching is good, but also I think sometimes if you get a particular mismatch, sometimes that can actually bring about a nice tone.
Right, because you can get some different harmonic content from the tubes. Yeah.
You do, and partly, some of that will be because the output transformer, whilst the valves are running, well, they might actually see a DC offset. So if you were to look at the output on a scope, the sort of crossover line won't necessarily be at 0 volts, and so you'll saturate the core a little bit. And all these kinds of things mean that whilst we think a matched set of valves is good because they'll give perhaps maximum power, it's a whole. We can go down a rabbit hole and discuss why a matched set of valves isn't necessarily the best thing to have in a guitar amp. And the reason for that is that years ago, in the days when, say, you would get a student amplifier like a low-powered Fender, as a for instance, the designers they'd probably look through catalogues or go to transformer suppliers and say, what have you got that will do this job? And a lot of the things would be off the shelf components, and the whole design might be a compromise built to a price, but they sound lovely because of just the way they behave once everything's working. And similarly with a Marshall or a Vox or anything like that, once they're doing their thing, it's only when you're standing there experiencing what they do that you can fully appreciate it. Hearing a sound off a record or a modeler, sometimes the only way I can describe it is two-dimensional, perhaps like seeing a film rather than seeing a film of a wonderful landscape or a place you'd like to visit. It's to actually visit it is a different experience, but you can still enjoy both images. But to be in the middle of, to visit the Caribbean, I haven't done that, but that looks lovely. But I can see pictures of it and it looks nice. But to visit it will be a totally different experience. And similarly with hearing a sound on a record isn't the same as experiencing your input to a valve amplifier and then getting something back because of what you've put in. Is a different experience to listening to someone else doing it all for you on a record or something like that. But going back to the no expense, I tend to waffle, by the way, in case you haven't noticed.
No, you're good.
I'll go off on a tangent. So the no expense bed, it was more a case of we will use what we know works, and we will make it reliable, but with ease of servicing in mind. Because these things, it's nice if you've spent a lot of money on anything. It's nice to be able to keep it running the same as the day you bought it. So we know that there are certain things we could spend, way too much. I had in mind, for instance, that I might like to use a certain type of potentiometer. A company called Clarostat used to make them, and they was sealed and looked very nice. And I spoke to another amp designer, chap I know, Mike Fortin, and I said to him about these pots, and he'd actually experienced problems after, and they weren't old. And so I thought, well, that's useful to know. So the no expense bit is, I don't know, I think we sort of like to make it clear that we wouldn't buy something or include something just because it's expensive.
Yeah,
but we want people to get the best out of it. So
I get that. It's optimized because there may not be, using mica capacitors everywhere may not help the sound, or something like that. So you just don't want to use them frivolously because they're mica, or you don't want to use.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's absolutely right. You don't. You could do that. You could put lots of expensive components in.
Yeah.
You're not guaranteed a wonderful amplifier. We're not building hi-fi amps here.
Yeah.
So that's a thing that needs to be borne in mind, perhaps. In fact, we actually want it ideally to malfunction a bit. Really, I'm sure that if a hi-fi amplifier designer looked at what I get up to, he'd probably need to go and have a walk, or he'd need to have a lie down or something, because we make, what we do is we end up making things or designing things with it in mind that we will push them into some mild form of overdrive or serious, form of, harmonic distortion, because that's what we want to do, because that's what's required. So you have to bear that in mind as well, that we will push things beyond what some engineers might consider are desirable limits. But if we like the end result and we achieve our end result, then we'll continue to do things like that. So it's I won't say it's beyond the scope of this podcast, but it's a long topic.
Yeah.
But like you say, you won't just say, well, these are the dearest, these are the most expensive capacitors. We'll have those, and we'll have these pots, and these pots. Well, they're $20 each, but we'll have those just because they must be best, because they're the most expensive, and that isn't the way to do it. We'd rather know that these whatever we use is going to last a long time. And if it's just an industry standard pot, you have to ask, well, if it is an industry standard pot potentiometer, for instance, why is it? And it's bound to be because of the reliability and the fact that it works well, around its whole track, so you don't have to sort of turn it, say, above 1 before you get any signal through or anything like that. So all of these things that we've learned from experience over the years, we know that we include this knowledge, so it doesn't. In fact, some of the things perhaps we've used are not the most expensive, but sometimes we've done things like on the circuit boards. We've used gold turrets purely because they look nice, and
Nice.
and they won't tarnish. They they'll make a good, reliable contact because gold's inert. So that any problems we might get or that might occur with certain construction techniques, it's less likely to happen perhaps with gold, but they look nice. And the boards that the turrets are mounted on, for consistency, I've actually put track underneath of those instead of wire, so that they can be exactly the same. Because, as I've said to people before, you could get somebody that might decide to leave bits of wire longer one day than another, or what have you. And the trouble is, particularly with a high gain amplifier, you can invite all kinds of problems.
Can be varied from that just alone.
Yeah.
Or noise,
or instability.
too.
Noise and instability. If you get an amp that has got bits of wire that has been tucked under the circuit board because no one will see it.
I've in my days of teching, I can remember seeing these beautifully wired amps until you remove the screw from the standoff and you pull it up and there's a spaghetti,
the garbage can.
Absolutely.
Underneath, yeah.
So I have a question for you, Martin, with this. So you designed the MK Clean, and you've picked let's say the best components for the end goal. You're making
Yep.
a high quality amp
Yep.
and purposefully picking components. When I don't know if you can remember this moment or not, but when the first chord you played through this new design, and you're listening, hopefully it worked the first time, and it comes through the cab. What are you listening for? Your decades of experience. There is, and we've all been there. You play a chord through an amp, and sometimes it's magical, and other times it's flat. Like, what are your ears listening for to be like, this is what I had in mind? Is there something you're trying to pick out in the early stages of development?
Probably, yeah. Well, definitely yes. But it's another thing I've often said is that I'm listening for a nice, not a hi-fi sound. If you plug a guitar into a hi-fi amplifier, particularly a solid-state one, that might be great for reproducing recorded music, but it's not nice. So I don't want that. I still want actually low levels of harmonic distortion, not sort of blatant overdrive or clipping, but that what we describe as chime or any number of other wonderful adjectives there are to describe the harmonic content of what you do. So I'm listening for that, but also I'm listening for almost to make my job easier as a guitar player, or anyone else's for that matter. So I know that with an MK clean, it's got to have that dynamic range. It's got to have that range of, if you hit it quietly, it comes out quietly. If you hit it loud, it's loud, but you don't want to have to beat every note out of the amplifier. So you still want it to have a subtle compression just to make your job a little bit easier. It's all of these things sound contradictory, what I'm saying here, but in fact, that's, I suppose, what makes even developing a clean amplifier take longer than you think it should, in a way. Because it shouldn't be that difficult, but it still is. And so that's what I'm listening for is kind of the harmonic content. I also like on a clean amplifier for the mid-range control to do a lot. However, that can bring about certain problems. Not problems, but if somebody plugs in and is expecting that kind of sort of like a very scooped Fendery kind of sound, some people don't like to have extreme settings, so they don't want to turn the middle control down to, say, I don't know, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. So I think that's going to be that's a case of educating. But for me, I like to have the mid-range control to do a lot, and the chime and the harmonic content, even if there's no apparent distortion. I like that, and the kind of touch sensitivity. So you don't have to beat your guitar to get everything to come out. So those are the kinds of things. And you're absolutely right. I have designed amps, and I think, well, I'll do this and I'll do that on paper. And like you say, you can plug in and play a chord, and it's like underwhelming. But I'm never disheartened, because I think, well, I know what I can do. I've always got things up my sleeve, or I know, having done this for a long time, I suppose I know that what I can do to achieve what I want with that circuit. It's not often I have to. In fact, it's really quite a rarity that I actually have to go and rip everything up and start again. Normally, I can get normally I'm in the ballpark with the circuit. So it's just a case of sometimes it's tweaking, but for a long time. But normally, even if I am a bit underwhelmed, I'm normally a long way away from where I started after a couple of hours or something like that.
Well, I even remember just going through the videos for the MK Clean, and speaking about, I'm not you, obviously, but some of the things that I heard right away when Chris Buck was playing, he's very dynamic playing. So he'll play really quiet for a bit, and then he'll dig in, going from finger picking to using his pick or his plectrum. And it felt like I could hear and feel his fingers brushing across the string, like the articulation in the amp. I was like, oh, this it sounds really good. And that detail, you're almost zooming in on what he's playing, but then it's surrounded by this kind of warmth and texture. And I don't know. I'm just trying to use words to describe it, but it just sounded detailed, but also rich. I don't know. Is that? Am I doing anything justice here? Are you just sitting there, man? This guy needs to read a book.
No, this is absolutely right. This is probably what I've been trying to do and floundering while I've been trying to do it. But these are the things, the subtleties, the nuances in a guitar player's style. And if somebody wants to use a clean amplifier and actually use it just on its own, then they will have worked on all the subtleties of their technique and how they play the guitar. They'll want those things to come through, so they won't. So I have to make sure that they can, but without and avoid the thing being squeaky clean at the same time. So you can have all the things that you associate, all the sparkliness and the low level harmonic distortion, which provides the warmth and also the sensitivity to bring out the subtleties. So all of those things that you've just said is really what I try to achieve, and I've got an idea of how to do it. Not, there's many ways to skin a cat, as they say. Funny expression, and I don't know where it came from. However, I've got a good idea of where I'm going to start, and anyone that knows valve amplifiers, tube amplifiers, will have a good idea of what goes on in the MK Clean. They won't be particularly surprised. A lot of it, some of it they will. They think, oh, that might be interesting. I might try that, or because that's how we all go about things. How we in this industry, we'll look at, if someone's doing something nice, then we'll want to try it, and we want to build on it. So I've always got a starting point for a particular type of circuit, and then thereafter I'll add bits. One of the things was trying to get the reverb exactly how we wanted it. Was trickier than you might think, because I wanted also to add a proper effects loop rather than some amps of that type will literally there'll be a break in the signal between where it comes off the tone stack or where it comes off the last gain stage, and it goes then into the phase splitter of the power amp. But there won't be anywhere to buffer the signal or to drop the signal level down to accommodate pedals.
So is the send coming out at -20, or where is it coming out?
It's thereabouts, I would think, but it is very much dependent on where you've got the gain set and the tone controls.
So there's not a separate send and return volume on the back of the amplifier. Okay,
no. Although probably I could have that on this amplifier, I just opted not to. And only because then it would, because I've got a send level on the reverb. that would have interacted with the return level, because the reverb I've put after the effects return.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that was the right move. What's the output? I guess the output impedance might be somewhat variable based on what you've got your amp set at, but typically is it like 500 ohms or something like that on the send? Or
the send, it's probably it's higher than that. It's probably near a 5K.
Okay.
Just a rough calculation in my head, but it's near a 5K, which is low enough, I think, for most pedals. Some, if you want to put digital rack units, it'll still be fine, but the impedance, you may need to adjust your input levels if you had some of the old rack units of yesteryear. But I doubt that, I won't say I doubt, but it's probably not something the sort of person buying the MK Clean would use.
Got it.
Very cool. I want to keep going here in just a second. I would love to ask you about the Duchess and the blend of, let's call it some modern digital technology and tube technology in the one unit. But before we get there, I'm going to throw to Brian to talk about the last two sponsors that make the podcast possible.
Okay.
Yeah, the last two sponsors that, as Grant said, make this podcast possible are going to be the guys over at BTPA, or Bestronics, if you know them. They supply all sorts. I basically, from A to Z, they have it. They have all those 2.1 millimeter DC connectors that we use. They have square plugs. They do wiring for boards as well as they do rack builds. You'll see a plethora of quad cortex redundant racks come out of the Bestronics facility with Brad and them. They do it on a daily, and they can supply any types of wiring, specialty cables that you need. Anytime you need these like 5-pin, the multi connections to do like your RJ inbox to control your amps or anything, they can supply it. So go use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off at btpa.com. Next are going to be the guys over at Mono Creators. I have a bunch of mono bags in my shop and in my front office right now. Their quality of their bags, of their gig bags, of their pedalboard cases, their power supplies, their pedal boards, everything that they have is top notch. If you're looking for the, nowadays, you're looking for the best quality over quantity when it comes to what you're buying stuff. So you want to make sure that you are buying the best, and the guys at Mono Creators can supply that. So go use the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 10% off at monocreators.com. You will not be disappointed. They have some of the strongest. It comes down to the minute details. The zippers and stuff are military, like solid grade. Like they just do the best stuff. So go check them out. Like I said, you will not be disappointed. I throw it back to you, Grant.
Awesome. I actually heard since the MK Clean came out that Mono's been referred to as the MK of the soft bag industry. Just quality all over.
Sounds just right.
Killing
it.
Really? So, Martin, again, like the whole reason I kind of really wanted to get you on to chat and then was really around the Duchess, and then I heard about the MK Clean and wanted to talk about that as well. But the thing that caught my eye and potentially my ears about having you on was the blending of kind of amp and cab sim, or let's call it cab sim, from Two Notes and tube amp technology all in one box. And I know you do kind of a range of different amp types, let's call it, or topology, from clean to more overdriven styles, but still with this idea of having amp sim outputs while also having line outputs in this kind of pedal board friendly amp, let's call it. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that? And this would be, I would assume, a completely different approach once you're integrating the amp and cab sim into this unit, as far as manufacturing and designing and all that. What was kind of the idea behind this? Maybe some of the challenges to creating this product.
The challenges, well, I think it was an idea that we'd spoken about lots of times, and I thought the best way to get this kind of valve sound would be to use valves. And then we had discussions, and my concerns were that if all valves are microphonic, so there are mechanical elements within that glass envelope, and if you change the proximity of one element to another, the charge between them will change, and you'll get an output, and it'll ring. And we know that. So it was a concern that that I voiced, but I thought, rather than just put things in my way, let's build one of these. Let's build an amplifier or a preamp, and then we will marry it up to one of the Class D output stages that we have available. And they've got all of their approvals in terms of electrical safety and EMC, emissions, etc. And so we did that, and we included our digital reverb that had gone into the V40 Duchess lunchbox amp. And we were quite surprised how good it did sound. Having thought, well, I don't know, will this work? It could be microphonic, could be this, could be that. And these were all things that we thought, or things at least I put in our way, or my way. And so we put it together, and we thought, yep, this is very nice. This seems to be a very handy thing that you can put in a gig bag, so it's not even as lumpy as a lunchbox amplifier. And if you've got a fairly small pedal board, with say a few of your favorite pedals, and you get any gain sounds, any overdrive sounds from overdrive pedals, and stacking them, this could, if we get the format right and we make the chassis from aluminium, we can put this on, we can make something that's lightweight, could go on a pedal board, and you can literally turn up at the venue, and if there's a cabinet, because the original ones didn't have the two notes technology, you could get to a venue, and if there was a cabinet there, you could do the gig. But then we thought, well, we could take this one stage further, and we spoke to the guys at Two Notes, because we thought then we can build this, or people can build their own pedal board around this Duchess, which that was our pedal platform amplifier, really. And then they could have all of their favorite pedals and something that can drive a speaker cabinet, but doesn't have to. If we put the Two Notes out, then they can hand a lead to the front of house engineer, and he can, take the sound out the front. It'll sound good because it will sound like a proper speaker cabinet mic'd up, and probably even better, arguably, than what might happen at certain venues, because the captures that they do for these cabinets capture more than you would at a gig. So if you've got a sound engineer and he puts a mic in front of your speaker cabinet on a stage, he's quite limited with what he just really needs to capture the middle of your speaker, pretty much. Whereas with these presets, IRs, etc., they're capturing a lot more than that. So it's actually a nicer sound to put out the front, and it really does sound quite real. Plus, by including the Two Notes, you can download the Torpedo remote app, and you could edit it on your phone at a gig if there were some tweaks you needed to do, because there is a USB socket. And so but the initial challenge, or my initial concern, was powering the valves, really, and making sure they behaved themselves inside that small enclosure that was destined to go on pedal boards.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about, are those all powered off of an ordinary power supply, or do they have like a mains connection in order to get the voltage to the right place?
What I do is, so the power amp module has what they call a hanger rail. So we use the ICE power modules. They have a thing on there called a hanger rail. The particular module we use, it provides about 44 volts. I think they say it can go up to 48. So 44 volts, and then we probably drop 10 volts or so off that just to keep safe. And the high voltage for the valves I derive from a boost converter circuit. So it steps because that boost converter that we need to use can only run at, I think, maximum 16 volts or thereabouts. So we step up something in the order of 14 volts up to about 300-ish volts, 370, depends on which one we're using. But also the hanger rail provides enough current to be able to feed the valve heaters. And they're the most current hungry. They're the ones really that consume the most power, are the valve heaters. So they're running at 6.3 volts and 300 milliamps.
Yeah.
But it is a mains connection, isn't it? Like you have to plug in an IEC cable.
Yeah, that's right. You plug that in. So we plug the mains connection into the power amp module, and then the power amp module supplies the 40 volts DC, and anything thereafter is derived from that 44 volts DC. So there are no transformers; it's all switch mode supplies.
Yeah. I think that's always the concern. I mean, in some ways, it's refreshing that people like you are using the AC mains, because it's just on DC alone. Off of an ordinary power supply, which is the direction that a lot of these are going, there are limitations as far as how high you can get I mean, there's obviously things like DC to DC converters, and that's ordinarily what they're doing. But even there's some out there that really are not relying on the 12AX7 very heavily to get the sound, and so it's sort of ornamental in the pedal.
Yeah. No, that is true.
We had Simon Jarrett on from Kingsley, and we chatted about that a little bit. And he brought up the fact as well that a lot of companies will put a tube in their circuit and basically just ignore it entirely. But they can say there's a tube in the circuit, but they aren't treating it the way a tube should be treated as far as voltages and all that. And so obviously, this is not the case here. You have tubes in the circuit. You're using them like a tube amp would be using them, more or less, to get the actual tonality and the feel and the compression and all that from the tubes themselves. Yeah.
That's what we're doing. There are either there's one of two things, as you say, ornamental. I like that because that's exactly what they are. And I don't think I've seen it in any guitar products, but I've seen it in some studio audio products where the valve it lights up. Yeah, and that's
all that matters, right?
That's all that matters. Yeah.
Look at that tube tone.
Look at that. Look at it. Yes, that's all you can do. That's I didn't want to do that, and I didn't want to have. Or derive if we, because we make various of these, and I didn't want to make any overdrive sounds using solid state technology and then just feed it through a valve. I could do, and that would probably work quite nicely, but I think I'd feel I was cheating people by doing that. So I want to, whatever goes to the power amp, I would, for me personally, would want that to come from valves, because then I can say it did.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've actually not played one myself, but we're both carried by Sweetwater. Both of our brands are carried by Sweetwater,
Yes.
and I as people do who are those that are selling through them, they have some obligation to appear periodically to do presentations, and one of your representatives in the US was coming right after us in terms of the presentation order for on the same day, and so I got to kind of hear. I think what you were launching at the time was kind of more of a EL84 kind of Voxy style sounding version of it, if I'm not mistaken. Does
Yes,
that sound?
copper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there may have been a few that were releasing at the same time. I don't remember in terms of the rollout of his presentation, but I remember it was sort of like tailor made for the sort of presentation that was at Sweetwater, where the audience is hearing it all through monitors and stuff like that, and so using the two notes in the impulse responses in collaboration with the analog tube circuit. From an audience perspective, it was very convincing to kind of be sitting out there and hearing it in that context. And he's just using the guitar into the copper, and then maybe a few pedals to kind of enhance it. But it was a very impressive sound. I remember speaking with the gentleman that was kind of the rep there, American guy, and it was really impressive.
That's nice to hear, actually. Thank you for that, because obviously the audiences do hear our equipment, but when there is a presentation like that at Sweetwater, then you've got a discerning audience who's listening. They're all listening and wanting to be impressed.
Yeah.
And so for you to be part of that and to say, yes, it sounded how I would expect that, then that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very discerning audience, and obviously they're deciding, they're making this calculation in real time as to whether, is this something I'm going to recommend to my customer or not, and from the perspective of you're getting a fully analog, sort of preamp section here, and it was a very convincing sound again especially for the size, in the world where there's so many fully digital or modeling representations that are sort of pedalboard based. I'm still inclined to try to stay in the analog domain for myself as much as possible. But yeah, it was really it was really cool to hear all that. But one question, I hope I don't divert us too far, Grant, away from the topic here, but I was just curious on your opinion on this, Martin, because it's always I think an interesting it's an interesting topic that comes up on forums a lot, is sort of the degree to which something is hand wired versus on a PC board, and sort of the what normal people or people that are not in a tech sort of field come to understand about sort of the differences between these two styles of manufacturing and designing amps. And I'm sort of curious where you kind of come down on that. Are you kind of doing a combination of things on the circuit board that don't have an issue being on circuit board? I think you mentioned that you track them. I presume that means that you put them on a PC board. And then are there parts that you'll hand wire off? Like, I know some people are reticent to put, any of the heaters on PC board because they think that that's more difficult to deal with from a manufacturing standpoint and a design standpoint. So they might hand wire that stuff off, or leads to the pots or to the tube sockets. Like, where do you kind of fall on that as far as what needs to be on PC board and what can be variable?
It could all be on a printed circuit if you want it to. And we haven't had any problems. But so a lot of our lunchbox and the smaller amplifiers, where there isn't the space, then things are printed circuit. But the MK Clean and MK Overdrive, those are all all of the pots and valve bases, they're all chassis mounted, switches, etc., all chassis mounted. and wired to those. The components themselves are on gold turrets that I mentioned earlier, and they're of a good quality, but not excessive, not huge, just because bigger is better or something like that. And because I was asked to work within certain space constraints, I didn't go mad for sort of 2 and 3 watt carbon film resistors in the signal path if I didn't need to. So I don't have a problem with printed circuit. I think an amplifier will sound different, but not because of the way it's manufactured, but it'll sound different because of the circuit in it. But I do like the hand wired ethic, and I think people like an amplifier where somebody's made it. There's been some human interaction in the manufacturing process, as opposed to just plugging it all together. And out comes an amplifier. I think they're the romantic idea, if you will, of somebody sitting there and actually doing things the old-fashioned way is what we're selling with the MK Clean and the MK Overdrive. So I wouldn't say one is better than the other, because it isn't. I think what you can have sometimes in terms of serviceability, if you get a component that needs to be taken from a printed circuit board, then you need to know what you're doing. I think if you go at it like a bull at a gate, you can end up pulling up pieces of track, pulling pads off. So you have to be careful from that point of view. So from a serviceability point of view, printed circuit is not always the best way to go, but it depends how you go about that. There are various grades.
Sure, yeah, I think it's definitely, as it was put to me, it's not the method, it's the implementation that yes. is important, and obviously somebody who's comparing the quality of a printed circuit board on a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, and then they apply that to all different sorts of types of amplifiers. It's not the same thing. It won't be the same as a Victory or something else. So the idea of pulling up solder pads just because you're using a solder sucker. There are some cheap amps where that'll just pull the trace right off the board, and
yeah. And it does happen even to the best of us.
Sure.
It's so frustrating when it does, though. Oh man.
Yeah. You can't. It is one of the things, and so it's one of the reasons that we for all the components that could be hand wired on the MK Clean, we put them on turrets so that if anything goes pear shaped, they don't, in my experience. But if they do, then it's an easy and reliable repair.
Well, Martin, I really do want to respect your time here, and I know we're coming up to the end of the podcast. I'll throw it to the guys to see if they have any final questions, and then we'll finish up. Brian, do you have anything, or Mason?
No, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for coming on. Really, it's always enlightening. It's one of those things, like as a rig builder, like I don't handle the amp as much. The most amp handling I've ever had was when I worked at Jackson, and it was hearing people trying to do different, learning about headroom and wattage and get it, hearing people being confused. But it's really enlightening to hear everything that you're thinking about and putting into that amp, and it looks beautiful, by the way. As someone who wrapped with I did Tolex, I've wrapped amps in, shockingly enough, canvases from like paintings and stuff, but I have leather. I had someone that had like a Texas flag which was a very interesting one. But
Only in Texas.
Only in Texas. It only makes sense. but I did one leather wrap, and it was just mind-boggling how like precise everything had to be. So it's very stunning. It looks beautiful. And yeah, just congrats on it, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, and just also appreciation for you, Martin. I've as I mentioned before we started, I haven't owned any Victory amps, but I did own a Cornford amp, probably 15 years ago, or maybe a little more than that. And I've always appreciated your work from afar. So thank you for all that you do for us in the world of tone, and thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me. Nice one.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it.
Thank
you.
All
the best on future releases. Excited to see what you come up with next.
Yeah. And we may speak again, perhaps.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. Awesome.
Okay.
See you guys.
Cheers. Thank
Bye.
you.